Boardroom Bound, Episode 10. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder that you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's show, we'll be speaking with an expert on corporate governance from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Paul DeNicola is a principal at PwC's Governance Insights Center, where he works to extend the firm's thought leadership in the area of corporate governance. A frequent speaker at forums for directors and governance professionals, Paul advises boards, executive teams, and investors on emerging governance issues. He's also an associate professor at NYU's Stern School of Business, where he teaches courses in corporate governance and professional responsibility. He serves on the board of the Society of Corporate Governance and the New Jersey chapter of the National Association of Corporate Directors. He's also a member of the Markets Advisory Council of the Council of Institutional Investors. Busy man, important man, lots of knowledge, taking time out today to chat with us, and he's dropping some dimes. We get lots of great knowledge today, so before we jump into the show, I'd like to give a quick thank you this week to 3 more people who've left a 5-star review on iTunes for Boardroom Bound. Thank you so much for Mark, for those writing, for those of us with aspirations for significant impact. Alexander and his guests are insightful and helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Dave H., who said Alexander and Beth, speaking about Beth Francis from the ECCF, did a fantastic job educating potential board members what to anticipate. Great to learn about a trustee training by Essex County Community Foundation. Sounds like a worthwhile program. And then Dielza said, this podcast is relevant and ensures people are equipped for boardroom success. Well, thank you for that great feedback. We're delighted to know that we're helping other people. That's the whole point of this podcast. Now, if you want to leave a rating and review on iTunes, I would so appreciate that. Please be sure to leave your blog or somewhere that I can link to in the show notes. I'd be glad to do that for you. Now, for today's commentary, Paul's going to share some of the stats. So they do an annual survey, it gives a lot of facts and a basis for what he's going to be able to give to us. For example, there's about an 8% turnover in S&P 500 companies in terms of their board members every year. And about a third of those are people new to a public company board, which is inspiring and insightful for many of our listeners who aspire to be in that situation. Paul's also going to share with us what it's actually like to be a board member and the transition to thinking about doing that. For example, it's all about the noses in and the fingers out. We'll find out what that means. Let's jump into the show. Paul DeNicola, delighted to have you on a Boardroom Bound podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
And I'm excited. So in my background, I'm a former management consultant. I did a dozen years in the industry, and I'm aware of PwC and some of the great work that you guys have done, and thrilled to be connected with the Governance Insights Center today and tapping into your expertise. And I'm sure you'll be bringing in all of what your unit does. So thrilled to be having PwC on our show with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And I think a good start would be if you could just give a background. So perhaps not everybody's understanding what management consulting does and the different sectors and how they work. If you could just give us a deep dive into your unit, how it exists, what you guys do on a day-to-day basis, what it looks like, and all the different sort of board experience that you bring to the table and what you share with some of your clients.
Yeah, sure. So our group, the Governance Insights Center at PwC, has got sort of some elements of management consulting, but it differentiates itself in some ways too. So we are a group, a relatively small group, about 15 of us within a very large firm that focus exclusively on corporate governance. And so our goal is really to be a resource for all of our firm's partners and engagement teams as they deal with both our audit clients and our non-audit clients, particularly with their boards and the executive teams that would interact directly with the board. So think, obviously CEO, CFO, investor relations, internal audit, legal, HR, key functions that would would have visibility, significant visibility in the boardroom. And our role really is to provide sort of leading edge thought leadership. So our group publishes a newsletter every couple of weeks, and over the course of the year, we publish large surveys of board members and institutional investors. We put out white papers on best practices, but probably what we spend the majority of our time as a group doing is, one, being out there talking publicly at industry conferences on particular corporate governance matters, but also we spend a significant amount of time interacting and providing education for board members. So we often get asked to come in and talk about specific governance issues, or a board may be interested in understanding, what's going on in the landscape, what shareholder priorities are going into a proxy season. But primarily, we give a perspective and education on corporate governance in boards and the executive suite.
And so for someone who's newer to this space, is perhaps listening to the show and aspiring to be on a paid board director role at a public company, can you break down corporate governance a bit more? What would that look and feel like? What are the main elements of it? How would someone who's thinking, I want to be, perhaps someday aspire to be on a JP Morgan board, what does that actually mean to me?
Yeah. So, right now, we're seeing at S&P 500 companies, for instance, we're seeing turnover of board seats at somewhere around 8% per year. So that is 8% of the board seats every year turning over. So we're getting rather decent new size classes of directors into those companies. When you think about corporate governance, ultimately, it is a three-legged stool, right? There are the roles of the different parties. So there's management's role in, running the business day to day. There is the investor role, right, or the investor leg of the stool. And that's both institutional investors and retail investors. And then there's the board role, which is the third leg of the stool. And the board role really is to serve as representatives of investors, overseeing the work that management does in running the business. And so probably the biggest distinction to think about, particularly as you consider shifting from an executive role to a board role, is that, the challenge is how do you define oversight? Because your role as a board member is not to run the business. Your role is one of oversight. And so the strategy of the company is ultimately management strategy. Now, does the board have a role in strategy? Of course they do. So their strategy, they're challenging the assumptions behind the strategy. They're pushing management. They're monitoring how management is executing on the strategy. But those are all oversight roles as opposed to actually running the business. So one of the biggest challenges for a new director is really shifting the mindset, especially if they've been running a business unit or business units for most of their career and are, really focused on, getting, rolling up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty,
right.
Is moving to a different type of role as a board member than you would in management. The phrase is often, noses in, fingers out, right? So you're getting a sense of what's going on in the business, but you're not actually running the business.
I think that's our Twitter for the day right there. Noses in, fingers out. And can you also break that down a little bit, Paul, between someone who is perhaps already in the C-suite, so they're on the board as an executive director, but at some point will want to take up a non-executive director, perhaps working for another company. So they've got a sense of what it's in and perhaps are already working towards noses in, fingers out, but it's different because then they're going to go back and implement that themselves in the company. How does that transition work? Are there any pitfalls?
Yeah, so the we're starting to see more executives, sitting executives, actually sit on the boards of other public companies as part of their overall development. And obviously, one of the big challenges there is actually one of time commitment. And so you can think about, your average public company director in their role is going to spend somewhat in the area of 250 to 300 hours on average per year in that role. Okay, so one of the challenges we do see is while I think it's great to have sitting executives, particularly executives with certain skill sets, sitting on other public company boards, it always becomes a time management issue, right, between their day job and their role on the board, which is why over the last 5 or 10 years you've seen a significant decline in the number of sitting CEOs that sit on boards. It used to be that a CEO might sit on 2 or even 3 other boards. Now they're really maxing out at 1 because their primary role is to run their own business.
Right. And in terms of your experience, are you seeing that sort of the vacant seats that open up as a result of that being filled more by the up-and-comers, so let's say the next C-suite people, or are you seeing it perhaps be those who are retired and now have the time to take on more board roles?
Yeah, so I would say the average age of a director today in the S&P 500 is about 63. So in lots of companies, the board is made up of retired executives or those who are professional directors. That is someone who may serve on 2 or 3 or even 4 public company boards and is a full-time director. So I'd say that there is significant change over the last several years around this issue of board composition, and there has been pressure put on companies, particularly by their large institutional shareholders, to think about the next generation of board members, particularly around issues of diversity. And that is from a gender diversity perspective, from a racial and ethnic diversity perspective, from a diversity of background. Ultimately, what you want to get at is diversity of thought. But when you look at last year's class of new board members, but for the first time, a majority of the new board members last year were diverse in some way, either from a gender or a race and ethnicity perspective. So that's a big trend there, and that again is coming from the way in which major institutional investors are looking at the board diversity, board composition, the importance of board diversity.
And I think most of us have read the studies about, for example, just simply having females in the room. The decision-making is very different. The risk tolerance is very different. Paul, how much are you seeing in terms of a skill set and experience? If we think about how the world is different now than it was 10 years ago, think about social media or cyber, things like that. How much is that influencing the next gen of board directors as well, those sorts of topics?
Yeah. So every year, PwC's Governance Insight Center does an annual corporate director survey. And one of the questions we've been asking for over a decade is, how important are certain areas of expertise, in terms of having them on the board? And year after year, the top answers continue to be, financial expertise, operational expertise, risk management expertise. And those have been pretty consistent. The areas where we've seen a jump, coming back to my point around diversity, is we've seen a significant increase in the prioritization of gender and racial and ethnic diversity on boards. Interestingly, on cyber and IT, while boards do prioritize that, when we look at the number of, for instance, chief information officers or chief information security officers that are currently sitting on boards, it's only about 4 or 5%. So a very small percentage have actually brought cyber experts onto the board. That being said, cyber risk is, risk oversight is a huge area of responsibility for the board. What we see sometimes is that when board members want to bring that expertise, want to know what the right questions to be asking of the management team are in their oversight role, but perhaps don't want to bring onto the board someone who's got a deep but potentially narrow area of expertise, they're using outside advisors to help them in that area. So they're still looking, I think, to bring on individuals with a broad business experience. But the good news is about a third of the new directors that came on to S&P 500 boards were first-time directors. That is, had never served on a public company board before. And, it used to be that one of the prerequisites for serving on a board was having served on another public company board. And it was a sort of chicken and egg.
But I always love that chicken egg thing. How do you get a job without experience? How do you get experience without a job?
Exactly. But, that is evolving. And boards are becoming more diverse in expertise and makeup over time. It hasn't been as quickly as many would like, but if you do track the data over the last 10 years, there has been an evolution in the board.
And Paul, I'm sure for our listeners, that's a very exciting idea to hear that a third of the seats that are newly filled are filled by first timers, because that's what many of our audience are aspiring to, or perhaps they've gotten there first and there's a snowball effect to get the next. In your experience, having talked to lots of board, hearing what they're thinking, what is it that allows someone to get that first seat? Is it the network that we generally hear is the right advice, or is it something else?
So if you look at, and our survey, our annual corporate director survey tracks this too, if you look at the way in which directors are recruited, the number one way is professional networks, followed by executive search firms. So, I mean, those are sort of the two primary ways that I'm seeing. I would say that one of the things that I notice when I talk with aspiring directors is that, and some of the coaching that I give to them is that a board resume looks very different than an executive resume. In terms of the skills that are highlighted. Again, really focusing not only on what executives have done to manage businesses, but where they've served in oversight capacities. So, I think the professional network is key. I think there are lots of ways to continue to enhance your personal brand to be able to be considered for these roles. I think, for instance, there are all over the U.S., there are local chapters of governance organizations like the Society for Corporate Governance, on whose board I sit, or the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. In every major city, there are chapters. And they hold periodic meetings, and those are a great opportunity to learn about hot topics in governance, but to engage with people who sit on boards and get to know them, because again, professional, one of the predominant ways that you're recruited onto boards.
And Paul, I imagine there must be some people sitting here going, well, you're probably in the best seat. You are meeting with all of these organizations and all of these boards. You have all of this inside knowledge. You're probably getting pitched on board seats all the time. Can you give us a little bit of cold water on that? Is that true? Or is someone should aspire to be in your seat to have all these networks and connections? How does it actually work for yourself?
I'm probably, I think when I look at it, a number of our partners at PwC who retire often go to sit on public company boards. We have some independence requirements as an audit firm around which boards are acceptable for them to sit on. But yeah, you do see a fair number of, now I'm not an accountant by my training, but for instance, you see lots of audit committees that are looking for members of the audit committee who have deep expertise in financial reporting and deep experience in financial reporting. And so, the audit committee is a likely place for, a big four, accounting partner who had retired. I think that, broadly, what the skill sets that boards are looking for, governance is one of them. If you look at the major committees, audit, compensation, and nominating governance, it used to be that the audit committee was carrying, the heaviest load. And then post financial crisis and post Dodd-Frank, you saw the executive compensation committee carrying a huge load when there was much more of a focus on compensation. Now it's really shifted in some ways to the nominating and governance committee around these issues of board composition, board diversity, board tenure. How long should you as an individual stay on the board and still be independent in your thinking, right? There's a lot of debate in governance circles around that. So there's also been far more direct engagement between investors and board members in the last 5 years than ever before. It used to be that any engagement with the major investor was done by the CEO, the CFO, investor relations. It was viewed as a management level responsibility. But now, part of the new job description of being a board member is that the capability of if one of your major institutional investors wants to meet with the board on a particular governance item, having the skill set on the board to be able to conduct that engagement. And that's happening far more frequently now. Our survey finds about half of public company directors say someone on their board other than their CEO has met directly with investors.
And I'm assuming that's usually the lead independent director, or would it be someone else?
Well, it's often the lead independent director or the board chair if the roles are separated, but it could be, for instance, if the shareholder has concerns about compensation, could be the chair of the compensation committee. If they have concerns about board diversity and tenure, it could be the chair of the nominating and governance committee. So, one of the things you really have to think about, one of the skills you could bring to the board, as a new director, is being camera ready, for those type of engagements that are, again, happening far more frequently than they ever did.
Well, it's amazing how complex it's gotten versus the old days, right? And it's a good thing in many ways, how it's growing more sophisticated. So, Paul, boards are bringing you in to talk about the pain problems today, but also anticipate what's coming tomorrow, to get ahead of it, to be aware of it, to be prepared for it. What do you tell them to get ready for on the horizon, both maybe on the short term and the longer term?
Yeah. Probably the biggest development I've seen particularly over the last year or two has been an increased focus on by boards and because investors are increasingly focused on this on ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors. We've just issued a paper at PwC on ESG that might be helpful in trying to define what it means from a board perspective. And so, there is some confusion there. When people hear ESG, they often think of, the purely environmental, right? They think of things like climate change or environmental impacts or environmental remediation. But it's far more than that. ESG issues are everything from, culture of the company to gender pay equity to labor practices. ESG issues are a broad set of topical areas that have a significant impact from a risk and strategy point of view. So we've certainly seen a fair number of companies face problems with their corporate culture through, the Me Too movement. A number of companies have really tried to had difficulties grappling with culture, and I'd say corporate culture is one of those key ESG factors. I think when we talk about ESG with boards, it's really about understanding how those factors fit into overall corporate strategy and the board's role and oversight of corporate strategy. So I'd say, the forward-looking board now is really taking these as their management teams are developing strategy. They're really asking probing questions as to how management is taking into account these ESG factors in formulating and then ultimately executing on the strategy.
And we will link to that ESG survey in the show notes. We'll also have a link to the annual corporate director survey you mentioned. But in my prior role when I was at JP Morgan, my final position was helping run our corporate social responsibility group. And Jamie Dimon, who's both the chairman and the CEO, was giving a lot of direction down on behalf of the board about how important this was as an ESG topic. It was defining a lot within the company. I had never sat in the boardroom to hear the discussions, but I can only assume that was a big part of it. So I think that resonates. And would you say that this is commonplace, say, across the S&P 500, or is ESG just gaining momentum and becoming bigger and it's still just a smaller proportion today?
So I would say that prior to 2 years ago, it was rather infrequent that I was asked to come into the boardroom to talk specifically about ESG. Over the last 2 years, it's probably ESG factors are probably a majority of the requests that we're getting. So, to your question, is it more of a focus for larger companies? Yes, in some ways, but that's sort of the history of corporate governance, right? If you look at corporate governance evolution, the changes start with the mega cap companies that adopt governance practices, and we see ultimately over time, those practices make their way through the S&P 500, then down to mid-cap companies and small-cap companies. So it's sort of an evolution, a top-down evolution from a size point of view. It's also an industry and sector point of view, right? So the ESG issues that are going to impact, an oil and gas company are going to be different from those from a financial services company versus different from those of a retail and consumer company, right? So certain ESG metrics are going to be more important based on sector. But I would say broadly, the focus has been on ESG at the largest companies.
Okay. So, Paul, one of the big things we talk about regularly in the show is people projecting themselves forward, thinking about the roles they want to go into and positioning them to do that. So I'm just going to project forward on your career, right? Very successful where you are now. I'm sure when you retire from this role, you'll be asked to be on multiple boards. If you were projecting that, and this is a good example for the rest of us, is trying to find the right fit where it would grow and develop, what is an opportunity that you would look for and say, this is exactly what I would want to walk into? Because I'm sure that'll be helpful for others as they begin to think about that themselves, because fit is a big part of it. How would you think about that in your career?
Yeah. So, one of the interesting things that I've seen occur with people, particularly when they're getting onto their first board, is they, particularly if they had successful careers at large companies, their expectation is to join the board of a large cap company, right? And we know that those are there are a relatively limited number of those board seats that become available. So what I would project onto I would take my own advice here is that if I was considering joining a public board, really getting on the first public board is the biggest challenge. And I would not be reluctant to, if it was the right situation, step onto a board that was a small cap company or a mid cap company, where I saw a real opportunity to contribute, to provide, my own expertise, and, to help improve that board. And often, after that first smaller or mid-sized company board, you're often then asked to serve on larger company boards. I wouldn't let that stand in the way. I mean, the other thing to consider is serving on private company or family-owned, large family-owned company boards as a interim step, before sitting on a public company board, and even in some cases sitting on large, national nonprofits gives you a good experience for what it means to be in that oversight role, and to be a board member. And that you could do, earlier in your career, to help sort of prepare yourself for what may lie down the road in a public company context.
And I think that makes sense. The experiences and stories you'll get from that will help you refine your messaging, your positioning, the network you build. I as we talk now, pitchers and catchers are beginning to report for spring training for baseball. I liken it to moving up through the minor leagues before you get to the major leagues. You've got to show that you've got the chops and the swing and all the other skills in order to get promoted up. Is that a fair way to think about it?
It's not something that develops overnight. It's really building your brand. It's really building your expertise from a governance point of view, and it takes a little while to understand what's expected of you as a director and how that's different than as an executive.
So, Paul, I guess my other thought, thinking about it forward, some people would say, I want a portfolio of board roles. I would like to be a professional board member someday. And there's a transition as well. There's a mindset shift. The workload is different. The timing is different. Can you speak to someone who's thinking, great, I'll get that first board role and then it'll go to others? How would you help set their expectations for what that would look like and feel like?
Well, the first, like I mentioned, the first board role is always the hardest to attain. But it used to be, even 10 years ago, that directors were serving on, a number of boards. You had directors sitting on, 5 or 6 or 7 public company boards. That's not the case anymore. One of the drivers for limiting the number of boards is the institutional investors are really concerned with what they refer to as overboarding, right? Mm-hmm. Whether or not someone has the capacity to sit on multiple large complex boards. So you have investors who have concerns about that. You have proxy advisory firms that provide recommendations on how investors should consider voting their shares at the annual meeting. They have concerns about overboarding. So it's really a balancing act. I'd say, the majority of directors today, I think your average director sits on, I think it's about 1.7 or 1.8 boards. So, it's really between 1 and 3 boards is probably where I see most, even professional directors. Not many sit on more than 3 public boards.
Well, Paul, I feel like we have covered quite a range of topics today, which has been fascinating. I can see why boards love bringing you in and picking your brain and sharing the knowledge. And I know we're going to have a couple of takeaways in our show notes. We'll link to both the ESG report and the annual corporate director survey. But if there are some of our audience members that would love to learn more or follow up with you, what would be the best way for them to be in contact?
Yeah, so I'd say that if they would like to stay in touch, PwC's Governance Insight Center webpage has got tons of resources on corporate governance. You can sign up on our website at pwc.com to receive our publications regularly. We publish something every week, whether it's our newsletter or our thought leadership pieces. And get invitations to events that we may be hosting or sponsoring in the governance space. So you can sign up for that there. That's probably the best way to stay in touch with us, or to contact me directly at paul.denicola@pwc.com.
Well, I know that I follow some of your social media stuff. There's some great content that comes out there, which of course links back to the website. So, Paul, we were delighted that you were joined on the show today, and thank you so much for sharing your insights and helping all of us be more boardroom bound.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks again for having me.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Paul DeNicola of PwC, someone with years of experience advising boards, understanding exactly what they're looking for today, the problems they're trying to solve, and what's coming up on the future radar. He gave us all sorts of insight today about how someone would prepare themselves for a board, how to position themselves for a board and think about it. And probably the biggest challenge that he described for us is moving from, say, the C-suite, from being an executive board member to the non-executive side, where you have to think about being fingers out and noses in. Very different mindset. If you've enjoyed this episode, I would just encourage you to take 30 seconds to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews on iTunes are one of the best ways to get the word out about this podcast. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the show. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.